Hey, my name is Tom Decker. I live in New Brighton, Pennsylvania, and I'm here to talk about my dad's World War II experiences. My dad died in October 2012, so he's not here to tell his story, and I think he's got a kind of unique story about his experiences in World War II. My parents were both from Connellsville in Fayette County, and they met while working at Troutman's department store in Connellsville. Troutman's was a small chain of department stores. They had stores in Newcastle, Butler, Washington, Greensburg, and Connellsville. Mom worked in the office, and she handled the advertising for the store. Dad was a janitor, night watchman. That's where they met. And at the time that they were engaged, Dad got notice about a draft, and World War II broke out, and he wasn't happy. He wasn't going to go into the service, and he didn't want to be drafted. So he got a draft notice, and he had to report to Greensburg to take the test, do the physical. He's going through all the various stations, gets to the station where you do examine your vision. The examiner tells him to cover your right eye, read that line. He does that, no problem. Okay, another, cover your left eye, read that line there. I can't see it, Dad says, so how about this line here? My dad says, I can't see it. Finally, the guy in frustration points to the big letter E at the top. What's that say? My dad says, I can't see it. The guy shouts at him, what are you, blind? My dad says, yeah, I am. Why'd you tell me? My dad says, you didn't ask me. So he calls the doctor in, and they examine. Turns out he is blind in his one eye. Doctor wants to know what happens. He said, well, he was 4 years old, and he was playing with a toy, a little mechanical toy. Wanted to know what made it work. He's taking it apart, piece flies off, hits him in the eye, and it blinds him. He's afraid to say anything to his mother, figuring he's going to get in trouble for breaking his toy. So that night, they're getting him ready for bed, and she notices something wrong with Dad's eye. And what happened to your eye, Harry? Well, he tells her, playing with a toy, and it poked him in the eye. So they take him up to Connellsville Hospital. This was back in 1922. Dad's 4 years old. And there's nothing much they can do, but they admit him for a couple of days for observation. The children's ward, he said, was full, so they put him in the men's ward. And all these men are saying, what's that little girl doing in here? Because he had long hair, which back in those days wasn't uncommon. So that kind of affected my dad's life, his loss of his eye. Dad was a conductor on the B&O Railroad. His uncle and his godfather were locomotive engineers in the B&O. He had an uncle that worked for West Penn Rail, so he always wanted to work for the railroads, but he couldn't get hired because of his eye. He couldn't do anything. Back in those days, if you had somebody that worked for the railroad, you were automatically in, pretty much. So it always affected him. He couldn't really get any good jobs at that point. One of the jobs he had before he was working at Troutman's, he and a friend manufactured some kind of miracle household cleaning product. And they used to go around door to door, mostly in the coal mining towns, to sell this stuff, And anytime my dad would get a job, they'd find out he was blind. Well, you can't work here, you only got one eye. And finally, in frustration, my dad decided to go to school in Pittsburgh for a 3-month course at the Pittsburgh Comptometer School. Comptometers were like an early mechanical calculating machine, so he learned how to operate that and did some office training, and finally was able to get a job, a decent paying job. Even when World War II broke out, like I said, he was still having trouble getting a good job. So he gets hired for the A.M. Byers company down in Ambridge, gets hired in the payroll department. Mom and Dad get settled in. Comes another notice, report back to Greensburg, back to take another physical, and the same thing all over again. Well, we can't use you, you've only got one eye.
And what year is this?
This was 1943 at that point, or late 1942, I'm not quite sure. So the doctor says, we need a report from your family doctor about how you lost your eye. So he goes back to A.M. Byers, back to Ambridge, figuring everything's okay. Next thing you know, he's getting drafted. He's pretty upset, and he's worried. He only has one eye. What happens if you put him in combat, you know? Mom and Dad have to pack all their stuff up and put it in storage, all their furniture, put it in storage, move back to Connellsville. Dad goes down to the station by himself, train station. He wants no one to be with him. He's upset and he's worried. Gets on the train, winds up taking basic training at Fort Meade, Maryland. And then he gets assigned to Fort Hamilton, New York, which is actually in Brooklyn. And it's one of the oldest Army posts. It's a very small place. There's no place to billet people, so what the Army does for the duration of the war, they lease the Hotel Breslin, big hotel in downtown Manhattan. And that's where he's billeted. And he's assigned to work at the Army Post Office. And Hotel Breslin, the food there was by a catering company. The food was lousy. Breakfast was pretty much Rice Krispies, you said. And they had, on the chow line, they had an MP there, guarding the chow line. If you try to take an extra roll or an extra piece of butter, you got your knuckles cracked. You only allowed one roll, one butter. One day they got a new lieutenant come in. The second lieutenant was going to be in charge of the mess hall. He took the MPs off, and the guys were allowed to get extra if they wanted to, take an extra roll, take an extra pat of butter. The guy said, this guy's not going to be here too long. Sure enough, he said, 3 days later, that second lieutenant was gone. The MPs were put back on. What happened, what was going on was the catering company, Dad still talked about it till the day he died, the Silver Standard Catering Company, they were stealing food to divert to their weddings and their bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs. Someone higher up was getting his palm greased, you know. After a few weeks, my mother joined Dad. She took the train from Connellsville to New York City. She lived for a while at a woman's boarding house. And buddy at the post office said to Dad, why don't you get an apartment, you and Anna Margaret, where I'm living, you know, check with the landlady. Well, housing back in World War II was very scarce, if you know. So they go to the apartment and meet the landlady. And she says, well, I have no apartments available, but she took a liking to my parents, it seemed. But I do have a spare bedroom in my apartment. You're welcome to stay with me. So that's what they do. Mom has a bedroom with a window. Has a wonderful view of the apartment building next door, the brick wall next door, you know. But they were happy, they were together. And one day my dad asked his buddy from the post office, why do they keep calling her Baroness? Well, Harry, don't you know? I said, no, she's German royalty. She's a Baroness. My dad said I was pretty stupid. He didn't know what was going on, you know. Her name was Baroness Elsie von Rast. And they were friends up until the day she died. Every Christmas and throughout the year, they would exchange letters. She died in 1963. So I was kind of curious if I could find anything about her, because she was a German Baroness. Found on doing some research that back in 1920, she came to the U.S. under the sponsorship of the Cardinal of Vienna to raise money to help with the people that were suffering from the effects of World War I. A lot of people were starving in Germany. And found out that she went to New York City, she went to Baltimore, and she made an appearance in Pittsburgh raising funds to help, the starving in Germany. And then after that, she went back to Germany. Then in research, I found out in November of 1935, she came back to the U.S. Found out she shipped out in November of 35 from Bremen aboard the ship Europa, and she settled into Manhattan. That's where she lived until she died. My parents really enjoyed living in New York City. It was a big experience for them coming from a little town, going to a major city like that. My dad said you always heard stories about how New Yorkers were nasty. He said they were really friendly. He said they did everything they could for the servicemen. They provided them with, complimentary tickets to shows, and they really enjoyed New York City and always wanted to get back, but they never did. He was in the post office, worked at the Army post office, the APOs. He sorted mail, did all that stuff. He said the worst part of his job was when the lieutenant would come in and he'd point, you, grab an incoming mail bag, go down to the basement. He knew what was going to happen. They had to read the mail and censor the mail. And he said he felt embarrassed doing that. I mean, these guys are writing letters back to their loved ones, but you had to do it. It was part of his job, I never asked him if he found anything that had to be censored, but he had to do that. It was one thing he had to do, and he disliked that. Dad's mother had cancer, and he got a chance to come home on leave. And he's on the train, and who's the conductor? His dad. Harry, what are you doing? Oh, I'm going back home, Pop, for a weekend pass. So Dad gets home. He gets home, and there's a telegram from the Army ordering him to report back to Manhattan. He was pretty upset. He didn't even get a chance to stay at home to visit his mom. Like I say, she has cancer. So he gets back on a train in Connellsville, heading back to Pittsburgh, back to New York. This time his father's going the other way. Harry, what are you doing here? I thought you were coming back for a visit. No, Pop, I got orders to go back to New York City. He gets back, what's the problem? They had him do an inventory and participate in a parade. He was pretty upset. The war is basically over at that point, And his mother's got cancer. He should have asked for a compassionate discharge, but Dad didn't do that. He was kind of naive about a lot of things. He told me about the time he went on sick call. He was in the Army for 2 years, and he was sick. He went on sick call. The medic says, how long have you been in the Army? 2 years. This is the first time you're on sick call. Yeah. So his medic buddies, hey, come here, see this guy. This guy's been in the Army for 2 years. It's the first time he's on sick call. Because he said the guys in his unit, a lot of them they all were like him, they had problems, And he was the first time on sick call. They couldn't believe it because a lot of people in his unit were trying to get out of work. They were putting like bars of soap under their arms to try to get high blood pressure and that kind of stuff, Like I said, my dad, he just kind of went along. He never questioned anything. And he should have maybe tried to get a compassionate discharge after World War II. But he doesn't. He gets assigned to the transportation unit, gets assigned to a ship, the SS Charles Goodyear. If you know anything about Liberty ships, they were prefabricated. And they were made in record time. I found the story about the Goodyear. It only took about a month to build. Anyways, he gets assigned to the SS Charles Goodyear. Before they do that, they send him to Sergeant Major's school, a whole 2-week course. They promoted him to Sergeant Major, on paper. They gave him the stripes to wear, but not the pay. He was still a Tech 5 sergeant, you know. It upset him, you know. I'm doing the work of a sergeant major. I'm still getting paid for Tech 5 sergeant. So he wound up going on 3 convoys to Europe on the SS Charles Goodyear. And he wound up going to France, Italy, Belgium, and North Africa, hauling supplies overseas and bringing back troops. And the last trip, I found he kept a little logbook about his trip overseas. The last trip he left, they left New York empty. The longshoremen went on strike, so they had no cargo. All they had was ballast. And they went overseas and picked up troops and brought them home. Dad was talking about the condition of the ship. He says that only take about a month to build these things. They were all prefabbed. He said there was a seaman on top of the deck, and they're looking at the deck. The deck is wavy. It looks like a washboard. There'd been some rough seas. And that seaman, a seasoned seaman, he's all nervous. I don't think this is going to make it back, you know. He was really nervous. Dad said it probably got back to New York. They probably scrapped that ship. I did some research. The SS Charles Goodyear was sold in 1947 and continued service for a few years, and they finally scrapped it in 1968. Dad figured they should have scrapped that ship as soon as they got back to the harbor, but they didn't. Well, he was in Italy, like I say, in France, Belgium, and also North Africa. One of the things they took to North Africa was grain, and they just unloaded the ship there right on the dock, and all this grain is there, and Dad's concerned, what happens if it rains? What's going to happen? His buddy says, Harry, we're in Africa, it never rains. It's nothing to worry about. But he got to go to, like I say, France and other cities in France, and, you know, did some touring. And remember walking into an Italian village. He had some, you know, shore leave and everything. And there was this old Italian man pointing to like a bombed out building or something. And he's going to my dad, Americano, Americano, you know, like he was upset. And my dad's thinking, well, if you guys didn't start the war, we wouldn't have bombed you, you know. But he didn't really talk too much about that. So Dad was overseas a total of 9 months. And during one of his trips home is when he got Mom pregnant. And he came back, and Mom worked in New York City. She worked for the Texaco company. They had a big office at the Chrysler building. Dad finished his duty, and he picked up Mom at work. It came out of the Chrysler building, and Mom was pregnant with me. She came over, walked to the curbside there in Lexington, and vomited. She had sickness, you know. Dad says, that's it, you're going back to Connellsville. So Mom went back to Connellsville when Dad finished out his time in the service. He was in for a total of 3 years, went in February of 43, and was discharged in February of 1946. Returned home. His mother died April of 1946, and I was born in May of 1946. Like I said, my dad should have asked for a compassionate discharge. His mother was dying of cancer. And the Army knew about it, but they didn't really care, you know. His commander knew that his mother was sick with cancer. My dad would often talk about, you know, I never should have been in the Army with my condition, only one eye, but he said he was glad they had a chance to do it, and he was grateful for the opportunity. They moved to Baden after World War II. Dad went back to A.M. Byers and resumed his job in the payroll department. And a lifelong friend of his, when they moved to Baden, would often say to my dad that You know, if I would have gone into the Army, it would have killed my dad. And this man, his contribution to the war effort was he delivered milk for his dad. His dad owned a dairy in Baden, and that's what he did for the war. He delivered milk. And he said that several times to my dad, and Melvin's wife would apologize to my dad. She says, Melvin shouldn't have talked to you like that. There was nothing wrong with Melvin. There's no reason why Melvin couldn't have gone to the Army. He just didn't want to. You know, so the draft system was never fair, as you know that. There's a man with one eye, and they draft him. There's a guy that, nothing wrong with him, and his job, keep America safe, was deliver milk. So I didn't have a college deferment like, you know, other people did. I decided to join. I was working in radio at the time. I was a DJ. And I decided to join and sign up for journalism, military journalism. So I signed up for a 3-year program. In the Army back then, they guaranteed you your training. Didn't necessarily guarantee you a job in that MOS, but pretty much they spend all that time and money, you're going to do that. So that's what I did. I signed up for journalism. Took basic at Fort Jackson in the middle of winter. And went to journalism school at Fort Benjamin Harris in Indiana. Got assigned to the 4th Infantry Division in Fort Lewis, Washington. They were getting ready to go to Vietnam. And so I was part of the advance party that went over to Vietnam. We settled in the base camp outside of Pleiku, Vietnam, up in the highlands. And I was there for about 9 months, and then I decided to extend my tour by 9 months and got transferred down to Nha Trang, Vietnam. I was there for a year and a half. I was going to extend another 9 months, be there for a full 2 years, and that's when the Tet Offensive broke out. My parents were upset that I already had been there as long as I had, and I thought, I better go home. So I went home in March of '68, went back to the States and was stationed at Fort Sam Houston, San Antonio, and I got out of there in December of '68. When I was in the 4th Infantry Division, we published a newspaper. And when I transferred down to Nha Trang, I was assigned to the 1st Field Force. And we put out a monthly, not a monthly magazine, it was a magazine. I was a photographer and a journalist. Yeah, it was an accelerated course, I think like almost 3 months, I can't remember. You did everything. They taught you photography. They taught you the basics. You know, they taught you the basics of how to write stories. And yeah, you wrote stories about what was going on. Of course, they were heavily censored. Well, yeah, I wrote a story about an artillery unit, and the commander was all excited about these rounds that they were using. They were called beehive rounds. It was sort of like a grenade that would come out and it would send out shrapnel everywhere. That came back from MACV in Saigon, censored, you know, that we didn't do things like that. You know? I wanted to stay another 6 months or whatever and finish out my term in the Army there. I didn't want to go back to the States and write about the general's wife's tea party or something. I thought that'd be kind of boring. And my commander in Vietnam was from San Antonio, native San Antonio, and I got orders for Fort Sam. He says, oh, you got to go back. You're going to like San Antonio. You're going to like Fort Sam. So I said, okay. Plus, the Tet Offensive had broken out, and my parents were already worried that I'd been there for a year and a half. I don't think they could stand another 6 months. So I went back and finished out at Fort Sam Houston. I was assigned to the hospital radio station. They had a closed circuit radio station at the hospital, and the guys would listen to the radio through speakers, pillow speakers. That's what I did and finished out my service there at Fort Sam Houston. I remember landing in Pleiku Air Base. It was up in the Highlands. Like I say, I was part of the advance party in the 4th Infantry Division. I wanted to go on a boat. Never been on a boat. I wanted to go on the boat because it was a 3-week trip, not a 3-day tour, you know, like the SS Minnow. But I knew that once you left the States, your tour started. You know, I thought, great, be on a boat for 3 weeks. That's 3 weeks out of a year, you know, 11 months to go, you know. I get picked to go as part of an advance party. We flew out of McChord Air Base, which is right across nearby Fort Lewis, Washington. Flew in a C-141, luxurious accommodations. Those nylon seats that fold down, you know. There's no windows on it, of course, it's a cargo plane. And the meals were just, you know, literally just TV dinners, the aluminum TV dinners, you know, that was it. Landed at the Philippines, refueled there and had some breakfast there. Landed one of the Coral Islands, I think, I can't remember, it's been so long. And then flew into Pleiku Air Base. Then we get off the plane. There's all these Air Force guys, and they're walking around with no ammunition, no guns. I think, my God, they're up there in the hills waiting to shoot at you. I didn't realize that, you know, there was safe areas there, and Pleiku was, you know, fairly safe at that point, you know, especially in the daytime, you know. Loaded us onto Army buses, and the buses all had screens on the windows in case somebody decided to throw a grenade or something at you. And drove, I don't know how many miles outside of Pleiku to a place called Dragon Mountain. That's where the 4th Division was based. And from there, they load us onto APCs and take us into base camp. They drop the back door down to the APC into mud. The driver says, "Welcome home, guys. Here's your new home." And I'm thinking, I'm really depressed at that point. I mean, who would build a base camp during the monsoon season? The 4th Infantry Division did, you know. Just got out of the APC, and Captain Hardy was one of the information officers. "Decker, I want you to do a story about this unit." You know, I've been in country, what, half an hour? He wants me to do a story. I have no idea where the hell I am or anything, you know. Next day I go do a story, find this unit, and they write a story about them. And a few days later, General Westmoreland came for a visit. It was on a Sunday. I guess on Sundays, Westmoreland liked to travel around and meet different troops in the field. And he addressed us and shook our hand and welcome to Vietnam. This is going to be an important year in your life, and it's you're going to be changed men. And it did change me. I became cynical after I did. I became cynical, you know, about the war and about the government. And I remember one of the movies I saw before I went into the Army was a thing called Dr. Strangelove. You ever see Dr. Strangelove? I laughed. I thought it was funny. The second time I saw the movie was on TV. I was down at that time at Fort Sam Houston after I came back from Vietnam. I didn't laugh as much. And the third time I saw the movie, I didn't laugh at all because it was pretty much true. You know, if you stop and think about it, how the Army and the military acts, you know, wasn't as funny. To tell you the truth, overall, I enjoyed the Army. I didn't like the living accommodations. The Army back then, it was all barracks. I had 2 wall lockers and a foot locker. That was it, you know. Not like the Air Force, you know, where you had better living accommodations. Oh, one time, shortly after I was in Vietnam, we had to go to the air base at Pleiku. Like I say, we were living in tents with a ground floor too, nice ground floor. And we had to go into Pleiku to the air base for some reason. And my buddy says, "Hey, you want a milkshake or a banana split?" Yeah, right. I'm serious. Do you want a milkshake or a banana split? What are you talking about? Come on, they got a place up there. It's like a Dairy Queen. So we go to the Air Force Base, and there's a place there, like a Dairy Queen. They're selling, you know, milkshakes, banana splits. We're back at base camp at the 4th Division. We're drinking Jello because they had no refrigeration. You know, that's nothing. Come on, we'll go see their barracks. And we're walking through the barracks, and I felt like Jethro Clampett. Wow, they got cement floors here, you know. Wow, they got electric lights, you know, and everything, you know. I couldn't believe it, how the Air Force lived. At that time, the unit I was working in put out a little morning newspaper to be distributed. It was mimeographed, if anybody remembers mimeograph, you know. We did this little morning newspaper and distributed it to local bases in the area in the Trang. And one night the lieutenant came in, one afternoon I should say, the lieutenant came in and says, we got to get this done early because they're expecting trouble. Because it was, you know, the start of Tet. So we left that early morning, or late, actually we left early that day, we left early in the evening, and went out the gate at the MP, and he says, they're expecting trouble, just to let you guys know. We went out there with no weapons because we're supposedly in a secure area. So we get back, and then we're in bed. The sirens go up. The sirens go off. We get up, and we have to go to get our weapons. Our weapons were secured. We didn't have weapons with us. They were kept in an arms room. In this case, it was an arms. They used a Connex container to store our arms. We get up. They gave us weapons. I don't even know if they gave us ammunition, come to think of it. Maybe one magazine. And we go out on the perimeter because there was fighting down the road from us. Down the road from where our camp was in base in the Trang was the headquarters for the Koreans. Their headquarters were down the street. And there were other military compounds that were full of, you know, high-ranking military officials and, you know, secure offices, and they were attacking down there, and they were figuring they were going to come down to us because my compound was headquarters for 1st Field Force in Vietnam. And after a while, they say, okay, it's all over, go back to bed. Turn your weapons in. Turn our weapons in. 45 minutes, maybe an hour later, sirens go off, everybody gets up. Issues weapons and ammo. I think they did give us a clip of magazines. And then daylight comes, you know, turn your weapons in, go to chow. And we've been up all night, you know, on the perimeter, just in case somebody tried to attack our compound. This is the Army for you. We had a guy in our unit, everybody called him Nick the Greek because he was Greek. Anybody who got Greek was called Nick the Greek, you know how that goes. And there's Nick the Greek. He's in his uniform with shower shoes because everybody said get up. They didn't say get dressed. Everybody get up and grab your weapon, you know. You can't come in here, you got shower shoes on. Go back with proper shoes on, you know. In the meantime, there's people killed down at the next base and bodies laying around all over, you know, the Trang. And I remember that very much, you know. And speaking, right across the street from our compound, there was a communications center. And they came over begging for weapons and ammunition. You're not a part of this unit. The unit across the street was part of Camp McDermott. which was it was a air base up the street. They were up, well, a couple miles up the road, really, and that's where they were headquartered. But you have to get weapons from your unit. In the meantime, there's VC snipers running all over town shooting whatever moved. You know, that's the Army for you. I kind of felt, well, we had invested so much in money and men, lives lost, that we should see this through, you know. But at the same time, I saw the futility of it, you know.
Yeah.
One of the stories I was covering was an operation up in the Central Highlands. If you ever seen the movie Hamburger Hill, it's similar to that situation where they finally took this hill, and I went up there and took some photographs and interviewed a few guys, and the VC had been dug in there. They napalmed that hillside. They bombed the hell out of it, and they thought it was safe. They walked up the hill and still met enemy resistance. They were dug in there deep. I realized those people were determined, you know, and they weren't going to give up. And I had friends of mine that had been in Vietnam or had been in the service. We should have nuked them. I said, that wouldn't stop those people. They were determined, you know. I said, to me, it reminds me of the British during World War II. No matter what the Germans did to England, they weren't going to give up. We will never surrender. And I just saw the determination. And I felt they were never going to give up. It was just, it was a lost cause. I met a photographer for the AP. At that time, I was, for some reason, I was down in Pleiku at the base in in the city of Pleiku. They had a base there, the Army did, or MACV, for journalists. It was a place for them to, you know, do their stories and you know, place to stay at night. And I was down there, a friend and I were down there for some reason. Well, I don't remember the reason we were there. But I got a phone call from our base back at Dragon Mountain, and he told me to tell this photographer, Kayushi Sawada, I remember him, that he had won the Pulitzer Prize for photography, and I went and told him. And it was for the photograph of a Vietnamese woman and her 2 children, and they're swimming across a stream to escape the Viet Cong. And I told him that, you know, you won the Pulitzer Prize for photography, and he just went, wow, wow. And wasn't several months later, he was killed over there, taking photography, taking pictures. A lot of people think that you were a photographer, you had it easy, but you were never safe in a situation like that, you know. Some people made fun of Al Gore because he did the same thing. He was a journalist over there also. And people don't stop and think how many, particularly civilian journalists, have been killed in wartime, covering stories, photographers, writers, journalists. Ernie Pyle is a good example of people that were killed over. And during the Vietnam Tet Offensive, to backtrack here, there was a photographer. He was in the Signal Corps. He wasn't attached to my unit, but he worked with us sometimes. And he was stationed out at Camp McDermott. That's where his unit was. And he volunteered to go out and take photographs. And he literally died in the arms of another photographer. He was shot. He was from Queens, New York. He had about another month to go, and he was going home. He was shot, you know, killed, taking photographs. And another guy when I was in the 4th Infantry Division, he was a journalist, and he had only been in country about a month, maybe a month and a half at the most, and he was out on a convoy, doing a story in a convoy, and The vehicle he was in hit a landmine and he was killed. So, I mean, you might have a job that you think is maybe safe, but you were never safe, you know. I would go out in the field without a weapon because my weapon was an M16. How am I going to take photographs with an M16 around my neck or a notepad? And I remember going out to wherever I was, and the commander says, "Where's your weapon?" I said, "I didn't bring it, sir." You know, and he was kind of upset. "Well, what are you supposed to do?" I said, "I'm here to take pictures and write a story about your unit, you know." And I figured, I didn't say it to him. I said, you know, I figured if we get into a fight, there's somebody's going to get shot, and I'll use his weapon if I have to. I don't know why we couldn't have a 45 with us, but that wasn't authorized for us. You know, there's the Army thinking, you know, nope, your weapon is an M16. 45s are for officers and MPs, you know. I mean, it made more sense to have a 45 than try to lug a M16 around trying to take pictures and do my story, do my job.